Chapter 2. The Real Case Against the Prisoner. In attempting to unravel the tangled skein of passions, prejudices, and political intrigues with which the last days of Jesus are interwoven, it has always seemed to me a sound principle to go straight to the heart of the mystery by studying closely the nature of the charge brought against him. I remember this aspect of the question coming home to me one morning with a new and unexpected force. I tried to picture to myself what would happen if 2,000 years hence a great controversy should arise about one who was the center of a criminal trial, say, in 1922. By that time, most of the essential documents would have passed into oblivion. An old faded cutting of the Times or Telegraph, or perhaps some tattered fragment of a legal book describing the case, might have survived to reach the collection of an antiquary. From these and other fragments, the necessary conclusions would have to be drawn. Is it not certain that people living in that far-off day would go first to the crucial question of the charge on which he was arraigned? They would say, what was all the trouble about? What did his accusers say and bring against him? If, as in the present instance, several charges appear to have been preferred, they would ask, what was the real case against the prisoner? As soon as we set this question in the forefront of our inquiry, certain things emerge that throw new and unexpected light on the problem. It will help us to understand of what these significant things are if we consider first the very singular character of the trial itself. For not only did it take place in an unprecedented hour for such proceedings, but it was marked throughout by peculiarities of a special kind. Consider in the first instance the vital element of time. All historians agree that the arrest of Jesus took place in the Garden of Gethsemane at a late hour on the evening immediately preceding the day of the crucifixion, and there is strong justification for believing that it could not possibly have been earlier than 11:30. This estimate is based on the amount of time required by the recorded events between the breaking up of the supper party, probably in a house in the upper city, and the arrival of the armed band in the garden at the foot of Olivet. There are three things that point irresistibly to the hour being late. 1. The disciples were manifestly tired, and even the sturdy fisherman Peter, accustomed to lonely vigils on the deep, could not keep awake. 2. Both Matthew and Mark refer to three separate periods of slumber, broken by the periodical return of Christ from his prolonged communing under the neighboring trees. 3. The fact that it was dark, and that owing to the use of torches, Christ was able to discern the approach of the arrest party a considerable distance off. Arise, let us be going. Behold, he that betrayeth me is at hand. Mark 14:42. No one can read the records of this extraordinary episode without realizing that this particular sojourn in the garden was different from any of those previous visits to the same spot hinted at by John. These men were being held there by the will of Christ long after the time when they would have ordinarily been in their beds at Bethany. They were waiting at his bidding for something for which he was also waiting, and which was an unconscionably long time in coming. Assuming the supper to have been at 9:30 and the garden itself reached as early as 10 p.m., the arrest could hardly have been effected much before 11:30. This fixes for us with some certainty the hour of the preliminary trial. It is generally agreed by archaeologists and students of the topography of ancient Jerusalem that an old flight of steps descended from the upper city to the gate leading to the pool of Siloam at the southeastern angle of the city wall. Nehemiah mentions, quote, the stairs that go down from the city of David. And again he says, by the fountain gate and straight before them, they went up by the stairs of the city of David, at the going up of the wall. Nehemiah 3:15, Nehemiah 12:37. There were thus two routes open to the arrest party. One was to follow the course of the Kidron Valley to the foot of these steps, and thence to the high priest's house. The other was to take the main Bethany road into the new town, and thence by the Triopian Valley to the priestly quarter. Even if tradition had not strongly indicated the former, it is clear that to have conducted Jesus through the populous quarter of the lower city would not only have been inexpedient, but would have necessitated a detour by which the valuable time would have been lost. And in this strange nocturnal business, time was a very important factor. If therefore by some magic reversal of the centuries we could have stood at some vantage point in the old Jerusalem about midnight or shortly afterwards on that memorable 14th of Nisan, we should probably have witnessed a small party of men leading a strangely unresisting figure through the darkness, along the rocky defile that skirted the precipitous eastern face of the temple wall, up the historical causeway at the southeastern angle of the city wall, to the headquarters of his avowed and inveterate enemies. How did it come about that the most distinguished Hebrew of his generation found himself in this dangerous and menacing situation, in the dead of night, on the eve of one of the most solemn of the Jewish festivals. What were the secret and hidden forces that precipitated his arrest? Why was this particular and highly inconvenient moment chosen? Above all, what was the gravamen of the charge brought against him? It will require much more than this chapter to answer these questions, to which indeed the whole book is a very partial and inadequate reply. But two things stand out sharply from the records of this trial and call for the closest study. The first is the peculiar nature of the only definite charge brought against Jesus. The second is the admission upon which his conviction was based. Now it seems to me that we make a grievous mistake if we assume, as has so often done by Christian writers, that everything that the priest did that night was ultra vires and illegal. Of course, there are aspects of the affair that on any reading of the case must be considered definitely, and even flagrantly, to be at variance with Jewish law. That, I think, is conceded by every competent student of the Mishnah and the Jewish institutions as they existed at the time. It was illegal, for example, for the temple guard acting officially as the instrument of the high priest to effect the arrest. That should have been left to the voluntary action of the witnesses. It was illegal to try a capital charge, trial for life, by night. Only quote-unquote trials for money could be conducted after sunset. It was illegal, after the testimony of the witnesses had broken down, for the judges to cross-examine the prisoner. They should have acquitted him, and if the testimony given was demonstrably false, the witnesses should have been sentenced to death by stoning. These things lie on the surface of the situation, but beneath these flagrant instances of irregularity in the trial of Jesus, there runs a strong undercurrent of legality, an almost meticulous observance of certain minor points of the law, which is very illuminating and instructive to the impartial student of history. This fact emerges very strikingly if we study the singular way in which the very ground of the accusation shifted during the course of the trial. As everyone who has attentively studied the records knows, there were in all 3 main charges brought against Jesus during the course of the successive phases of the trial. We may summarize them briefly as follows. 1. He had threatened to destroy the temple. 2. He had claimed to be the Son of God. 3. He had stirred up the people against Caesar. The third of these charges can be dismissed from our consideration at once. It was not the real grievance of the Jews. It was framed solely for political ends. The Roman law took no cognizance of the offenses for which Christ was condemned to death. Yet without Pilate, the death could not be consummated. It was absolutely necessary, therefore, to find a political charge to justify before the Roman procurator the extreme penalty they had already tacitly imposed. They chose the charge of conspiracy against Caesar because it was the only kind of charge that would carry weight with Pontius Pilate, or indeed with any representative of the Roman power. Even that almost failed, and would have failed completely, had the procuratorship been in stronger hands. But, as I have said above, it does not matter what the ostensible charge before Pilate was. The thing we are concerned with very deeply is what the real charge of the Jews was against Christ. When we concentrate on this, we get an extraordinarily luminous view of what was behind the prosecution. It must be remembered that, according to a long-established Hebrew custom, the accusers in a Jewish criminal trial were the witnesses. No other form of prosecution was legal, and the first clearly defined act in the midnight drama after the prisoner had been brought before the court was the calling of witnesses, as the law demanded. Both Matthew and Mark are explicit on this point. Mark says, "Many bear false witness against him," chapter 14, verse 56. Matthew says, "Many false witnesses came," 26, verse 60. Mark affirms that the evidence of these witnesses did not, quote-unquote, agree together and was therefore overthrown. To those unfamiliar with the subtleties of Jewish jurisprudence, and especially with the singular orientation of the law in favor of the prisoner, it may seem curious that, having been at considerable pains to secure witnesses for the prosecution, the court should have proceeded forthwith to reject the evidence. If the story of the witnesses was a deliberate fabrication, it should not have been very difficult to have harmonized it in advance, or, in the ancient phraseology, to have made it, quote-unquote, agree together. The very fact that the court did reject the testimony proves that, in this fundamental matter of the witnesses, even Caiaphas himself was under some compelling necessity, and to follow the characteristic Hebrew usage in a quote-unquote trial for life. What that usage was is described for us with great wealth of detail in the Mishnah. There were 3 classes of testimony recognized by the law. 1, a vain testimony. 2, a standing testimony. 3, an adequate testimony. There was a very practical distinction between these 3 classes of evidence. A quote-unquote vain testimony was testimony obviously irrelevant or worthless and immediately recognized by the judges as such. A quote-unquote standing testimony was evidence of a more serious kind to be accepted provisionally until confirmed or otherwise. A quote-unquote adequate testimony was evidence in which the witnesses quote-unquote agreed together. The least discordance between the evidence of witnesses, says the distinguished Jewish writer Salvador, was held to destroy its value. It is clear, therefore, that whatever may have been the subject matter of the preliminary witnesses referred to by the two evangelists, it did not get beyond the second and provisional stage. This can only mean that it was either demonstrably contrary to the experience and knowledge of the court, or it was invalidated on technical grounds. Mark's statement that it did not quote-unquote agree together strongly indicates the latter. But now comes a very curious thing. When this preliminary and unsatisfactory witness had been cleared away, two men came forward with a very definite and circumstantial piece of evidence. Mark says, "There stood up certain and bare false witness against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands.'" Chapter 14, verse 57 and 58. Matthew, who in this case is probably not quoting Mark, but drawing upon another ancient source, confirms it by saying, "But afterward came two, and said, This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God, and to build it in 3 days." Chapter 26, verse 61 and 62. Whatever else took place, therefore, on that memorable night, it seems certain that two men came forward, and, with the torchlight falling full on the face of Christ, accused him of having used words similar to these. Now, the thing of immediate importance is to know whether these men were deliberately inventing the charge, or were merely perverting for their own purpose an actual and somewhat similar saying of Christ. Even if no other data were available, I should personally hesitate to believe that so definite and circumstantial a statement was a pure invention. It is a much more deadly thing to distort what a man has said in the hearing of others than to lie deliberately about him. The distortion will elicit uproarious support from overwrought and angry men. Only the most brazen will voice approval of a deliberate and calculated lie. It always has been so, and we can be reasonably sure that it was so in this case. These men had heard Christ make a resounding statement in the temple courts, and there was no more deadly thing they could do than to give a distorted and misleading version of it at his trial. But there is another, and to me a very conclusive reason, why we may regard the testimony of these witnesses as a reflex of something Christ himself actually said on some public occasion. Both men declared that they had heard the prisoner use certain words that, if substantiated, involved the double offense of sorcery and sacrilege. The penalty for sorcery was death. The penalty for sacrilege was stoning and exposure of the body. From the standpoint of the enemies of Jesus, a more fatal charge could hardly have been laid to his account. Even so, the testimony was overthrown. Now, why was that? There must be a satisfactory and historical explanation. If the testimony of these two men had been an absolute invention, if it had originated in the scheming brain of Caiaphas, and the witnesses had, so to say, been quote-unquote put up to play their part, there would surely have been no bungling of the affair in this naive and exasperating way. After all, the witnesses had only a few words to say, and the most elementary sort of prudence would have secured their agreement in advance. The case against Christ ought to have gone swiftly and triumphantly to a conviction, but we do not find that kind of situation at all. We find a situation in which the court, despite all legality of its being in session at this very hour, wasted a great deal of precious time on a judicial process that carried it nowhere. At the end of all this elaborate hearing of witness, Jesus Christ was virtually unaccused and certainly unconvicted. The entire proceedings threatened to break down on a vital point of Jewish law. Two things emerged from this unquestionably historic fact. In the first place, Caiaphas was clearly not all-powerful to work his will in that assembly. There were evidently very strong influences in the council chambers in favor of rigorous observance of the law, particularly in the crucial matter of the witnesses. It must always be remembered that the judgment of this tribunal was not final. Whatever these men did that night had to pass muster the next morning before the great Sanhedrin in plenary sitting. There had apparently been trouble once before when Nicodemus, a member of that body, had protested against condemnation without a fair hearing. They could justify the illegality of the night hearing of the case on the grounds of high political necessity and the near approach of the feast. But any serious flaw in the accusation might easily have led to the compulsory release of the prisoner at a moment when immense multitudes would unquestionably have flocked to his side. The very fact, too, that the testimony was being sifted so rigorous implies a corresponding cautiousness of statement by the witnesses themselves. Under the Jewish system of jurisprudence, weighted as it undoubtedly was to lean in favor of the accused, it was a very dangerous thing to be a witness in a quote-unquote trial for life. The penalty for uttering a false testimony was death, hence the number of these trials was few.